The Mongolian steppe was a place where the sky seemed endless and the land unforgiving. Winters crushed life beneath blizzards and winds sharp as blades, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing. Summers were no reprieve, dust rose in shimmering waves, heat seared skin, and herds grew restless under a sun that offered no mercy. Out here, survival was not a guarantee, it was a skill, and only those who mastered movement, endurance, and resilience could hope to last. It was on this land, across nearly 3 million square kilometers of open grassland, that the foundations of one of history's most powerful empires were laid. Before Europe trembled at rumors of horsemen who seemed to fly across continents, before China watched its mighty walls breached, before the Middle East saw entire cities fall to fire and steel, there was only the steppe, a crucible of wind, grass, and silence, where entire societies were molded into something unique. Warriors who treated hardship as training and survival as second nature. And from this crucible, there would rise a boy who would become more than a leader. He would become an empire. Before the world named him Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, shaped by hunger, loss, and the relentless lessons of the steppe. To understand how he conquered half the known world, we must first understand the land that raised him. Stretching from the Alai Mountains in the west to the forests of Manchuria in the east, from the frozen edges of Siberia down toward the deserts of northern China, the Mongolian steppe was vast and merciless. It was not empty wolves roamed the valleys. Herds thundered across the plains. Rivers carved winding paths through grasslands. Yet for human beings, it was a place where one mistake could end a lineage. The climate defined everything. Winters could drop to 40 degrees Celsius. Firewood was scarce, so dung was dried and burned for fuel. The bitter winds scoured valleys clean of life, leaving families to huddle in their shelters, relying on dried meat, fermented milk, and fat stored from summer. Spring came late, often with floods that turned rivers violent. For only a brief season, grass grew in abundance, and families moved quickly to seize what nourishment they could for their animals. Summer brought blazing heat, swarms of insects, and the constant risk of raids by rival tribes seeking to fatten their herds at another's expense. Autumn was preparation, a frantic season of drying meat, milking mares, and stockpiling every possible resource before the cycle began again. But within this harshness was also a gift: mobility. Pastures were temporary. Rivers shifted with seasons. Survival demanded movement. To remain still was to die. Families followed nutug, traditional migration routes passed down through generations. Each clan guarded these routes with ferocity, for they were not only paths but lifelines. To encroach on another's grazing ground was not simply theft, but provocation for war. The rhythm of this world was not one of permanence, but of adaptation. Unlike sedentary civilizations, where stone walls promised safety and fields promised harvest, steppe life taught that nothing lasted except change. Survival meant anticipating the land's cruelty and preparing to meet it head-on. The Mongol people did not merely endure this, they thrived in it, their entire way of life sculpted by the demands of endurance. The land was a teacher, and its lesson was clear. Only the strong, the mobile, and the disciplined could survive. If the steppe was a crucible, the gur, the portable felt tent, was the vessel that carried life through it. To outsiders, it might appear simple, but in reality, it was an engineering marvel, perfectly suited for nomadic survival. Built from a wooden lattice frame that could collapse like a folding screen, the gur was topped with roof poles that curved inward to meet a circular crown. Over this skeleton lay thick layers of felt, pressed from sheep's wool. In winter, multiple layers held heat with astonishing efficiency. In summer, the outer coverings could be rolled back to allow breezes to flow through. A fully constructed gur could weigh 1/4 of a ton, yet be dismantled, packed onto camels or ox carts, and reassembled in less than an hour. Inside, the ger reflected not only practicality, but culture. The central hearth burned constantly, its smoke rising through the opening in the roof. Fire was sacred, seen as a living force that connected earth to sky. Around the fire, space was divided by custom. To the right, men kept their weapons, saddles, and tools. To the left, women stored household goods, cooking utensils, and chests of clothing. Guests were seated in places of honor. Shamans, in spots marked by ritual significance. To step into a ger was to step into the beating heart of nomadic life. Warmth, order, and community enclosed in a perfect circle. It was also a symbol of resilience. When storms swept the steppe, the ger bent but rarely broke. When blizzards struck, its felt walls held strong. When families moved, it came with them, ensuring that no matter how hostile the world outside became, there was always a center of stability. For centuries, the ger carried Mongol life across the plains, embodying the very values that would later make their empire enduring: adaptability, unity, and resilience. For a Mongol child, there was no soft passage into adulthood. Life began in hardship and quickly demanded competence. By the age of 3 or 4, children were placed on ponies, strapped tight if necessary. They learned balance not by choice, but by expectation. By 5, many could guide a horse with their knees alone, leaving their hands free to herd animals, throw ropes, or notch arrows. The horse was more than transportation, it was an extension of self. To fall from the saddle was to fail at survival. To ride confidently was to belong. From their earliest memories, children lived with the rhythm of hooves beneath them, the smell of sweat and leather in their nostrils, and the knowledge that without the horse, life was impossible. Weapons, too, came early. Boys learned to string small bows, their fingers toughening with each draw. By the age of 10, many could shoot accurately from horseback, loosing arrows while galloping at full speed. This was not a skill for war alone. It was needed for hunting, for defending herds, for protecting family. And hunting itself became the great school of war. Mongol tribes conducted vast hunting drives, sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes stretching across miles of open land. Hundreds of riders would spread into a wide circle, then gradually tighten it, driving deer, antelope, and wolves into a closing trap. For the young, these hunts taught discipline: to hold formation, to wait for the signal, to act in unison. For the experienced, they were practice for campaigns to come, rehearsal for the battles that would one day decide the fate of nations. The composite bow, the pride of Mongol warriors, was introduced early. Crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, it was a masterpiece of power, with draw weights between 80 and 120 pounds. It demanded years of practice, but once mastered, it could send arrows flying with deadly accuracy more than 300 meters away, piercing armor and striking terror into enemies who had never seen such weapons before. Thus, by the time a Mongol boy entered his teenage years, he was already a warrior in training, hardened by the climate, disciplined by the hunt, and bound to his horse, as if the two were one being. In this way, the steppe raised not only survivors, but conquerors. Among these children was a boy named Temujin. He was not yet a Khan, not yet the scourge of empires, not yet the man who would make the world tremble. At this stage, he was simply a child of the steppe, riding before he could walk, learning to hunt before he understood politics, and absorbing the lessons of endurance that the land taught without kindness. But the winds of the steppe carried whispers even then. Some children were destined only to survive. A few were destined to rule. And though Temujin could not yet know it, the skills he learned in those early years, mobility, adaptability, precision, and discipline, would one day expand far beyond herds and hunts until they shaped the fate of half the known world. The Mongolian steppe of the 12th century was not a single nation, but a fractured world of shifting loyalties, blood feuds, and fragile alliances. To the untrained eye, all nomads looked the same: families moving with their herds across endless grasslands, living in felt tents, surviving on milk and meat. But beneath the surface burned rivalries so ancient that even elders struggled to recall their origins. The banners that marked each tribe fluttered like warning signals across the horizon, each one a reminder that every rider on the steppe carried both kinship and danger. The Mongols themselves were not yet a unified people. They were splintered into clans such as the Borjigin, Taichiud, Jadarans, and Kiad, each tracing descent from semi-mythic ancestors. To the west, the Merkits guarded the fertile valleys along the Selenga River, their horsemen feared for their skill in sudden raids. To the south, the Tatars occupied the lands closest to China, growing wealthy on trade with the Jin dynasty, while raiding their neighbors with equal vigor. Further east, the Keraites held sway along the Orkhon and Toul rivers. Though nomadic, they were unusual. Many had adopted Nestorian Christianity through trade links with Central Asia. Their khans maintained courts with surprising sophistication. Scribes, emissaries, and foreign priests sat beside shamans and warriors. And then there were the Naimans, whose domains stretched toward the Altai Mountains. Unlike most steppe peoples, the Naimans employed scribes who recorded contracts, treaties, and histories. To the Mongols, whose traditions were passed orally through song and memory, this was a sign of both pride and suspicion. Literacy gave the Naimans power, but it also set them apart, and that difference often bred hostility. Each of these confederations was proud, ambitious, and jealous of its independence. No Khan accepted another as equal unless compelled by force or fear. Alliances were born in firelight and sealed with promises of livestock, brides, and blood brotherhood rituals, but they rarely lasted. A marriage that one season bound two tribes together might the next year ignite a feud over dowry, betrayal, or succession. Raiding was as common as herding. Livestock was the currency of power, and to seize an enemy's herds was not simply theft, but a declaration of dominance. Women and children were often captured in these raids, absorbed into new families, altering the bloodlines of clans and bolstering manpower. In this way, politics and survival blurred until they were indistinguishable. Leadership among the tribes rested in khans who combined lineage, charisma, and battlefield reputation. Yet no khan's authority was absolute. Power existed in a fragile web of oaths and obligations, always under strain. Betrayal was not an exception on the steppe. It was the rule. The wise Khan prepared not for loyalty, but for the moment when it would collapse. The steppe was a stage where today's ally was tomorrow's enemy, and yesterday's enemy might again be an ally by dawn. This was the world into which Temujin was born. A patchwork of clans bristling with suspicion, where banners marked identity but never security, and where every oath carried the weight of impermanence. Beyond the grasslands, across rivers and fortified towns, loomed the sedentary might of the Jin dynasty in northern China. To the emperors and ministers in Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, the nomadic tribes were both menace and opportunity. The Chinese remembered history too well. Xiongnu, Xianbei, Turks, all had swept out of the steppe in earlier centuries to batter China's walls, and sometimes carve out dynasties of their own. The Jin rulers understood that if the tribes ever united, they would face disaster. Their solution was not open war but manipulation. The Jin strategy was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Keep the steppe divided. Their envoys traveled north, carrying silk, grain, iron, and titles of honor. They conferred seals of legitimacy on one Khan. Then, on his rival the following season. They encouraged weaker clans to resist stronger neighbors, promising support that often arrived just late enough to prolong bloodshed without granting decisive victory. Trade was wielded like a weapon. The steppe craved Chinese goods, silk for prestige, tea for sustenance, and metalwork for weapons and tools. Access to these luxuries was a mark of status. The Jin dynasty rewarded cooperation with caravans of goods and punished defiance with embargoes or punitive raids. The tribes learned quickly: submit, and you grew wealthy; resist, and you starved. This careful balance of bribery, intimidation, and selective warfare kept the steppe in a state of near-constant conflict. Tribal wars flared with increasing frequency. A Khan who dreamed of unity would soon find his allies bribed away, his rivals equipped with Chinese steel, his prestige undermined by whispers of illegitimacy spread by envoys. The Mongolian plateau became less a homeland and more a chessboard, with every tribe a pawn, and the Jin emperor, the unseen hand, moving the pieces. Yet in their calculations, the Jin court overlooked one crucial truth: chaos can destroy, but it can also forge. In trying to prevent the rise of a single leader, they created conditions that would sharpen the one boy destined to break their strategy forever. In 1162, near the waters of the Onon River, a child was born into the Borjigin clan. His name was Temujin, said to be chosen after a Tatar warrior captured by his father. According to Mongol tradition, he entered the world clutching a blood clot in his fist, a grim omen that shamans interpreted as a sign of warrior destiny. His father, Yesugei, was a respected but modest chieftain, head of a small Borjigin following. Through raids, marriages, and alliances, Yesugei had carved a niche in the dangerous politics of the steppe. His most audacious act was his marriage to Hoelun, Temujin's mother. She had once been promised to a merchantman, but Yesugei abducted her during a raid, a deed both common and perilous. The merchants never forgot this insult, and their vengeance would haunt Temujin's family for decades. Temujin's earliest years were shaped by constant movement. He saw his father ride out at dawn with warriors at his back, returning with captured herds or new wounds. He watched his mother oversee the journey, teaching him that survival depended not only on strength, but on order. He grew up with the ever-present uncertainty of steppe life. Riders appearing on the horizon could bring feast or fire, alliance or slaughter. Yesugei understood the fragility of his family's position. To secure his son's future, he arranged a betrothal when Temujin was only 9. The bride was Berta, daughter of the Ongirat chief Daesechen. The marriage promised bonds of loyalty that might shield Temujin in years to come. According to custom, the boy was left with his future in-laws to serve them and learn their ways, a gesture of trust and a political investment in his survival. But fate's cruelty came swiftly. On the journey home, after leaving his son, Yesugei encountered a group of Tatars holding a feast. Despite ancient enmity, hospitality demanded acceptance, and he joined their table. The Tatars remembered their wounds. They poisoned his meal. Within days, Yesugei was dying, instructing his kin to remain united before his strength failed. His death left a widow and orphans exposed to the merciless politics of the steppe. The Borjigin allies quickly abandoned them, unwilling to risk their lives protecting a family weakened by the loss of its leader. Hoelun was left to fend for her children, with only scraps of loyalty from distant kin. Temujin's childhood, already harsh, now grew desperate. He watched his mother dig roots from frozen ground, catch fish from rivers with bare hands, and stretch meager supplies to keep her children alive. He saw his brothers quarrel over scraps, and he learned early that loyalty was not eternal. It was as fragile as the grass under the hooves of horses. From these experiences, Temujin absorbed lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. that betrayal was inevitable, that survival required discipline, and that leadership meant more than noble blood. It meant the strength to hold people together when everything else conspired to tear them apart. The boy named Temujin was no longer just another child of the steppe. He was being sharpened by hunger, abandonment, and loss into something else entirely. In time, the steppe would learn his name, not as a vulnerable orphan, but as a conqueror who turned betrayal into empire. The news of Yesugei's death spread across the steppe like wildfire carried on the wind. One day, Temujin was the son of a Khan, the heir to a fragile but respected banner. The next, he was a boy without a protector, his family left naked before the predatory politics of rival tribes. For the Borjigin, whose authority was built less on wealth than on Yesugei's personal reputation, the loss was catastrophic. Steppe politics showed no mercy. Within weeks, families who had once sworn loyalty to Yesugei began to drift away, each calculating that association with a widow and her children would bring weakness rather than strength. Even their supposed allies, such as the Taichi Ud, turned their backs. Ho Lun, Temujin's mother, suddenly found herself alone, responsible not only for her sons and daughters, but also for defending the remnants of her husband's following. She fought desperately to keep the clan together. But in a society where strength was survival, a woman without a warrior husband could not command lasting allegiance. One by one, warriors took their herds and departed. Chiefs who had shared meat and mare's milk with Yesugei looked at his widow with cold eyes and calculated that survival meant severing ties. The Borjigin were abandoned, left to wither on the edge of the steppe like grass scorched by frost. The young Temujin, barely 10 years old, absorbed this collapse with sharp clarity. His world shrank from a circle of warriors and allies to a handful of siblings huddled against hunger and fear. His mother's determination kept them alive, but her words harsh, uncompromising, demanding cut into him as deeply as the winter winds. She told her sons that betrayal was the nature of men, that no one could be trusted except those bound by her womb, and even then, vigilance was necessary. In her anger, she scolded them not as children, but as warriors in training, men who must learn to fight for every mouthful of food. The Borjigin orphans became wanderers. No longer did they follow seasonal migrations to fertile pastures. They were reduced to scavengers, surviving on roots, berries, and the thin catch of rivers. They watched other tribes pass with herds fattened on rich grass, banners snapping proudly in the wind, while they themselves crouched in makeshift shelters, ashamed and hungry. For Temujin, the humiliation was unforgettable. He saw clearly that honor and kinship were fragile shields. Shattered the instant fortune turned. The abandonment of his family was not merely a misfortune, it was a lesson. Leadership, he understood even then, could not rest on blood alone. It had to be earned, enforced, and guarded with discipline so strong that betrayal carried unbearable consequences. The years that followed forged Temujin more harshly than any formal training could have. Life became a relentless test of endurance. Without herds, the Borjigin family could no longer ride freely across the steppe. Horses were few, food scarcer still. To survive, the children learned to fish the Onon River with crude nets and traps. They dug wild onions and bitter roots from the earth, their fingers raw from frost. They chased marmots and rabbits, their stomachs growling louder than their voices. Temujin carried himself not as a child, but as one who understood that every mistake might mean death. When the river froze, he hacked holes in the ice with stones, lowering lines woven from horsehair into the black water to catch what fish lingered. When winter storms howled, he scavenged dry wood and dung to keep the fire alive. Hunger was constant, but worse still, was the humiliation of being mocked by passing tribes. Riders who once treated Yasuge with respect now sneered, calling the Borjigin children beggars. Some raided their meager stores, confident that Hoelun and her sons could not retaliate. Each insult seared itself into Temujin's memory. He said little, but he stored the bitterness like arrows in a quiver, to be unleashed when the day came. Even within the family, survival was brutal. Temujin's half-brother, Bekta, older and physically stronger, often claimed the choicest pieces of food. He lauded his dominance over Temujin and his younger brother Kasar. Could not always restrain them. The family's unity frayed, and Temujin learned the terrible truth that even kinship could fracture under hunger's lash. This was the hard school of survival, a crucible where weakness meant slow death. But Temujin did not merely endure, he observed. He watched how small bands of hunters coordinated, how elders rationed food, how disputes were settled when lives depended on swift resolution. From these scraps, he began to piece together an understanding. Survival was not luck, but discipline, and discipline, enforced without hesitation, could turn weakness into strength. The breaking point came with Bekta. Tensions between the brothers escalated until their rivalry became a danger to the family's survival. Bekta hoarded food, undermined Temujin's authority, and acted as though he alone would inherit leadership. To Temujin, this was not a quarrel, but a mortal threat. In a clan so fragile, divided leadership meant destruction. One day, as Bekta once again claimed what little food remained, Temujin and Kasar made their choice. With bows in hand, they ambushed their half-brother and struck him down with arrows. The killing was swift. The silence, afterward, heavier still. When Bekta's body fell lifeless, the brothers knew there was no turning back. Hoelun's grief was fierce. She had lost a son, not to disease or enemy raid, but to her own children's hands. Yet she also recognized the reality. Temujin had asserted himself as the true head of the family. Brutality had secured what words could not. This act of fratricide scarred Temujin deeply, but it also set the pattern of his life. He understood now, with chilling clarity, that loyalty could not be assumed, even within bloodlines. Authority had to be seized and defended, no matter the cost. Mercy to rivals, even kin, could mean doom. The fractured bonds of blood had hardened him. Where another boy might have broken under the weight of hunger, humiliation, and guilt, Temujin grew sharper, colder, more determined. He was learning the lesson the steppe itself had been teaching him since birth. Survival belonged to those who acted decisively, even when the cost was unbearable. And so, from the ashes of betrayal and the blood of his own brother, the boy Temujin began to emerge not as a victim of circumstance, but as the steel-hard leader the steppe had never before seen. When the riders of the Taichi-ud descended on Temujin's family, it was like a storm breaking across the valley. Hooves pounded the earth in waves. Shouts split the wind, and the thin Borjigin encampment, little more than a scattering of jurs and makeshift shelters, collapsed beneath the attack. Temujin fought, bow in hand, but he was still a youth, his body wiry and half-starved from years of hardship. His arrows whistled, one grazing the cheek of a raider, but within moments he was overwhelmed, dragged from his horse, and bound. The Taichi-ud did not intend a quick death. Death could make a martyr. Instead, they intended humiliation. A boy who dared act as a Khan's son, who spoke with fire despite his family's ruin, must be broken so that no whisper of leadership could cling to him. They fashioned a Kang, a heavy wooden collar with crossed beams that locked around his neck and shoulders. The device prevented him from turning his head freely or lying down comfortably. It made riding impossible. Even walking became a clumsy shuffle, the wood biting into his collarbones. The Kang was more than punishment. It was spectacle. Every household that received Temujin saw him not as a warrior, but as a lesson. "Here," said the collar, "is what happens to those who defy the Taichiud." Women carrying water paused to sneer at him. Children laughed, throwing clumps of dung as he stumbled past. Men mocked him, some yanking his hair to force him to bow. But humiliation has two faces. For the Taichiud, it was triumph. For Temujin, it was fuel. Beneath the weight of the collar, he studied his captors. He memorized the faces of men who spat at him, the gait of guards who underestimated his patience, the rhythms of the camp at night. What they thought was degradation became observation. Every insult hardened his resolve, every mocking laugh, a reminder that survival was not enough. He would have to rise so high that none could ever force his head down again. Nights were the worst. He could not lie flat, the beams forcing him into awkward positions. Sleep came in ragged bursts, broken by the ache in his neck and shoulders. Hunger gnawed at him, for captives ate last, after even the dogs had their fill. Yet, in those long, cold vigils under the stars, Temujin spoke silently to himself. "I will not die here. I will not remain a slave. This collar will be remembered not as my end, but as the first step towards something greater." It was a vow forged not in comfort, but in chains. Fate turned during a festival. The Taichiud, like all steppe peoples, celebrated victories and alliances with feasting. That night the camp came alive with drums, laughter, and the heady smell of roasted mutton. Warriors drank fermented mare's milk until their words slurred, their movements slow. Guards grew careless, shadows drifting from their posts as they joined in revelry. Temujin waited. He had tested his bonds before, feigning clumsiness to learn how tightly they were checked, feigning weakness to convince his captors he was no threat. Now, with the camp distracted, he shuffled into the edge of darkness. The wooden beams scraped his shoulders raw, each movement loud in his ears, but the noise of the festival drowned it out. He slipped between gers, past tethered horses who twitched but did not whinny, and into the tall grass by the riverbank. There he collapsed, the Kang pinning him like prey caught in a trap. Breathless, he pressed himself into the reeds as torches flickered in the distance. Dogs barked, and for a terrifying moment voices shouted search parties, perhaps already aware of his absence. He forced himself still, heart hammering so violently he thought the ground might tremble with it. And then came salvation in human form. Sorkin Shira, a Taichiud commoner of no great standing, found him in the reeds. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps admiration for the boy's defiance. Whatever the reason, he chose risk over safety. With his sons, he dragged Temujin deeper into the grass, covering him with reeds as riders passed. Later, under moonlight, they worked the collar loose. The wood split with a muffled crack, and for the first time in months, Temujin's neck was free. He wept silently, not from weakness, but from the release of a burden he had sworn would not define him. The Kang lay broken in the grass, a relic of humiliation now discarded. Sorkin Shira did not keep him long. Harboring a fugitive was a death sentence if discovered. But he gave Temujin directions, food, and the strength of his kindness. In that act of mercy, Temujin learned something that would shape his rule. Loyalty could be born, not of blood, but of choice. A man could be won by respect, by justice, by the promise of protection. By dawn, Temujin was gone, slipping through the folds of the steppe, free once more. But he was no longer the same boy who had been dragged into captivity. Chains had taught him patience. Humiliation had given him resolve, and kindness had shown him that strangers could become allies. Temujin's return to his family carried the weight of legend. Word spread faster than hoofbeats across the steppe. The boy who had worn the collar of humiliation had escaped the Taichiud. Tales grew with the telling. Some said he killed guards with his bare hands. Others whispered that spirits had guided him. Whatever the truth, his reputation swelled. Reputation was currency. And for the first time since his father's death, Temujin had more than hunger to offer. Men began to drift toward him, at first outcasts, youths estranged from their clans, hunters weary of unjust chiefs. They found in Temujin not a boy but a survivor who had endured what few could and returned stronger. Temujin welcomed them, but with rules. He was not his father, who had relied on kinship bonds. He declared that loyalty would be rewarded, but betrayal punished without hesitation. Spoils would be shared fairly, not hoarded by a noble few. Positions of responsibility would go to the competent, not merely the well-born. For the steppe, where nepotism and favoritism ruled, this was revolutionary. Around small fires, he listened to grievances. One man told of being cheated out of his share of plunder. Temujin promised fairness. Another had lost family because his chief abandoned them during a raid. Temujin swore that under his leadership, no one would be left behind. Slowly, these promises wove into a new kind of loyalty, one not tied to blood, but to justice. He trained his men relentlessly. Hunts became rehearsals for battle, coordinated drives, swift signaling, strict discipline. He demanded order even in small things. Tents erected swiftly, weapons maintained, horses rotated for endurance. His followers grumbled at first, but when raids succeeded with minimal losses, they began to see the wisdom in his rules. Among them were names that would echo through history. Jelme, a fierce and loyal warrior, Bo-Orchu, who became Temujin's shadow, and eventually others who would form the backbone of his army. What began as a handful grew into a band, and then into something greater, the seed of a nation. Temujin himself carried the memory of the collar always. When he looked at his men, he saw not just followers, but proof that humiliation could be transformed into power. Where once he had been mocked as a prisoner shuffling under wooden beams, now he rode at the head of a gathering force. His enemies had sought to make him an example of weakness. Instead, they had forged him into an example of resilience. The boy who had endured the collar of humiliation had become a leader, and in time, he would teach the entire steppe that no collar could hold him, nor any power break the unity he was beginning to build. The Onon River gleamed silver beneath the spring sun, its currents carrying the smell of thawing earth and wet grass. It was here, amid the familiar valleys of his childhood, that Temujin encountered Jamuka once more. Both were no longer boys herding animals, laughing as they chased foals through the fields. They had grown into men, each hardened by hunger, betrayal, and the relentless demands of the steppe. Yet when their eyes met, memories softened the years, and for a brief moment, the laughter of their youth echoed again in the space between them. Jamuka, leader of the Jadaran, was already recognized as a figure of stature. His lineage gave him legitimacy, his charisma drew followers, and his bravery in raids secured the respect of warriors. Temujin, though still rebuilding his strength, carried a different aura, the reputation of one who had endured humiliation and risen again. His escape from the Taichiud, his survival against starvation, his refusal to bow even when abandoned, had become stories whispered with awe. When they embraced, it was more than friendship renewed, it was destiny converging. They agreed to seal their bond with the ancient ritual of Anda. Before their men, they swore themselves as blood brothers, cutting their flesh and letting drops mingle with earth and wine. They exchanged golden belts, horses, and solemn words, never to betray one another, to share victories and defeats, to honor loyalty above all. The ritual meant more than kinship. In steppe society, Anda ties were sacred, considered stronger than blood. To betray an Anda was to damn one's own soul. Warriors who witnessed the oath felt a tremor of excitement. Two leaders of promise had become as one. Together, they would be unstoppable. For a time, the bond was real. Jamuka, bold and confident, led with flair. Temujin, austere and disciplined, brought order where chaos threatened. Each complemented the other. They shared fires, strategies, and dreams. Their men, though drawn from different clans, began to fight as a single host. The banners of Borjigin and Jadaran snapped side by side in the wind, a signal to rivals that a formidable alliance had formed. And yet, beneath the warmth of brotherhood, differences stirred. Temujin was building something new, something that did not rely solely on lineage. Jamuka carried the weight of tradition, bound by expectations of noble precedents. At first, these contrasts mattered little. Friendship, raids, and the thrill of shared victories drowned suspicion. But in time, they would matter greatly. The early campaigns of Temujin and Jamuka were a proving ground. Together, they led their men against rival tribes, small raids at first, targeting herds and isolated camps, then bolder strikes that challenged entire clans. Each raid served multiple purposes. Plunder fed their followers, victories attracted new warriors, and the mere act of raiding spread fear. Jamuka favored flamboyance. He was the first into battle, his golden belt flashing, his horse adorned with bright trappings. He inspired men through spectacle, his courage undeniable. His warriors adored him for his generosity, for his willingness to shower relatives and favorites with spoils. Under Jamuka, loyalty flowed through kinship ties, binding families and clans to him as though by ancient threads. Temujin, however, observed with a sharper eye. He respected Jamuka's bravery, but he saw its limits. Courage could win a charge, but it could not enforce discipline once chaos broke out. After successful raids, Jamuka's men sometimes squabbled over loot, each kin group claiming more than its share. The distribution of spoils often favored nobles, leaving common warriors dissatisfied. Temujin chose a different path. He demanded order before, during, and after raids. Scouts rode ahead to map terrain. Horns and flags directed movements so no warrior strayed from formation. When herds were seized, he divided them according to clear rules. Every man received a portion, regardless of birth. Nobles grumbled, but ordinary riders began to see something rare: fairness. Under Temujin, effort and loyalty mattered more than ancestry. This principle, merit over blood, was revolutionary. It bred loyalty that could not be bought with gifts alone. Men whispered at night. With Temujin, a herdsman's son might rise higher than a noble's. For warriors weary of betrayal and favoritism, the promise was intoxicating. The raids themselves honed their skills. Temujin transformed hunting techniques into battlefield strategies. Just as hunters encircled deer, his men learned to encircle enemy camps, leaving no escape. Signals ensured that riders struck simultaneously, collapsing confusion onto the enemy. Victories became cleaner, losses fewer. Yet every lesson also widened the gulf between him and Jamuka. Where Jamuka embodied tradition, Temujin embodied reform. Where Jamuka led by spectacle, Temujin led by structure. Their brotherhood held, but their visions for the steppe diverged with each passing raid. At night, when the campfires flickered and horses grazed in the dark, Temujin spoke to his men of dreams larger than raids. He told them that the endless cycle of betrayal and revenge weakened all tribes. He spoke of how the Jin dynasty thrived by exploiting divisions, bribing one Khan against another. He reminded them of his father's death, of his family's abandonment, of the collar that had marked his humiliation. This is the fate of divided people, he said. Unless we stand as one, others will always break us. His voice carried conviction born of suffering. Warriors who had endured betrayal themselves felt the truth in his words. He promised them a new kind of order, one bound not by fragile alliances but by law and loyalty. Spoils would be distributed fairly. Leaders would be chosen for merit. Betrayal would bring swift and merciless punishment. Jamuka, too, spoke of unity, but his dream looked backward. He envisioned the steppe ruled by noble houses, ancient customs preserved, power resting in the hands of those born to it. His men cheered this vision, for it flattered tradition, but Temujin's followers began to sense that their leader's dream was different, more radical, more dangerous, but perhaps more just. Between the two Andas, the contrast grew sharper. Yet, for the moment, the oath of brotherhood held. Together they remained strong, their combined forces large enough to intimidate rivals, their victories too frequent to ignore. Still, the steppe was not blind. Other tribes watched closely. Some whispered that Temujin and Jamuka would one day become enemies, for two suns cannot share the same sky. Others placed bets in silence, deciding whether to align with tradition or with the reformer whose eyes burned with relentless determination. Temujin himself understood the tension. He did not wish to betray his blood brother, not yet. The oath of Anda bound him deeply, but in his heart he knew a truth the steppe would soon force him to face. Brotherhood could not last when visions clashed so completely. For now, the bond endured, and together they carved their names deeper into the memory of the steppe. But beneath the songs of victory, destiny was already sharpening its blade. Brotherhood on the steppe was sacred, yet even sacred oaths strained under the weight of ambition. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka remained united, their Anda bond carrying them through raids, victories, and feasts. But unity among leaders is fragile when visions diverge. The first cracks appeared not in battle, but in governance. Jamuka, rooted in noble tradition, continued to favor his relatives. The spoils of raids often flowed into the hands of his kin, and warriors who had risked their lives grumbled that their share was meager. Temujin, by contrast, maintained his principle of fairness, rewarding men according to merit, whether they were noble or lowborn. His band, smaller but disciplined, grew fiercely loyal. Whispers spread through the camps. With Jamuka, blood decides your place. With Temujin, your deeds decide. To many warriors, especially those tired of being overlooked by noble families, the choice was clear. Temujin's vision promised them dignity. The tension became public when the two leaders clashed over the treatment of prisoners. After a successful raid, Jamuka distributed captives as gifts to relatives, reinforcing loyalty through patronage. Temujin argued that captives should be integrated based on skills, not ancestry, pointing to craftsmen, herdsmen, and warriors who could strengthen their host. The disagreement seemed small, but its implications were vast. Jamuka preserved the old order. Temujin was building a new one. The Anda oath bound them, but loyalty among followers began to split. Camps buzzed with debates, men weighing tradition against reform. For a while, the blood brothers brushed aside disputes with laughter, raising cups of mare's milk and recalling childhood memories. But behind the smiles lay a growing recognition. The steppe was not large enough for two such leaders. At last, the inevitable came. Around 1186, Temujin, with quiet determination, announced his decision to part ways. The separation was not dramatic, no shouting, no blood spilled that day. But to those who understood the step, it was as momentous as a thunderclap. An oath sworn in blood had splintered, and the step waited to see which vision would prevail. Once apart, Temujin moved quickly to define his movement. No longer bound to Jamuka's authority, he called together his followers and declared his principles more clearly than ever. Loyalty would be rewarded, betrayal punished, spoils shared fairly, and leadership granted by competence rather than ancestry. He began organizing his men into structured units, a precursor to the decimal system that would later define his armies. Groups of 10 trained together, learned to live as brothers, and were held responsible for one another's discipline. This innovation struck deep into the heart of the old order. No longer could warriors rely solely on kinship bonds. They were now bound by responsibility to comrades from different clans. Temujin's camp became a place of order amid the chaos of the steppe. Disputes were settled swiftly. Theft was punished. Warriors rose in status, not through birth, but through demonstrated courage and loyalty. Craftsmen and herders found themselves valued for their contributions, not dismissed as lesser men. For the first time, men who had felt invisible under noble chiefs discovered a leader who saw them. The result was astonishing. Word spread that under Temujin, even a poor herdsman's son could become a commander. Warriors who had once drifted aimlessly now sought him out. His host swelled not as large as Jamuka's, but stronger. In this crucible of reform, Temujin also forged deeper bonds with key figures. Jelme, who had once offered him a horse in his youth, became his unshakable companion. Bo Orchu, renowned for his loyalty, rode at his side in every raid. Others joined, forming the nucleus of a brotherhood, not born of blood, but of choice. Around their fires, men spoke with awe. Temujin is not like other Khans. He builds a nation from nothing. And though his numbers remained modest compared to Jamuka's vast following, his host pulsed with a spirit no mere kinship could replicate. Jamuka did not ignore Temujin's growing strength. To him, the split was betrayal, under or not. Worse, warriors began deserting his camp for Temujin's, drawn by whispers of fairness and opportunity. His pride wounded, Jamuka resolved to remind the steppe that tradition remained unshakable. The conflict came to a head when both leaders sought recognition as Supreme Khan. In 1186, Temujin's followers declared him Khan, their loyalty unshaken despite his modest numbers. He now held the title in name, if not yet in overwhelming force. Jamuka, infuriated, rallied his vast kinship network and declared himself the rightful Khan, boasting of the greater legitimacy bestowed by noble birth. The steppe braced for war not between foreign invaders and tribes, but between two former brothers whose visions for the future could not coexist. The clash erupted near the Onon River. Temujin's force, disciplined and modest in size, faced Jamuka's army of 30,000. Temujin could muster perhaps 20,000, but many were newly sworn and untested. The difference was not just numbers, it was philosophy. Jamuka relied on massed kinship strength. Temujin relied on discipline and merit. At first, Temujin's tactics worked. His men, trained in coordination, moved as one, encircling segments of Jamuka's army and striking with precision. For a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed as though reform might triumph over tradition. But numbers told. Jamuka's host pressed relentlessly, and as the tide turned, Temujin's men faltered under sheer weight. The battle collapsed into chaos. Jamuka's victory was decisive and merciless. Captured warriors were executed in brutal fashion, Some chronicles speak of Jamukha boiling 70 young men alive, a spectacle of cruelty meant to terrorize rivals into submission. To the steppe, it was proof of Jamukha's ruthlessness. To Temujin, it was confirmation that the old order ruled through fear, not loyalty. Though defeated, Temujin's resolve did not waver. He retreated with the remnants of his force, his principles intact. If anything, the defeat taught him that reform alone was not enough. He would need greater numbers, stronger alliances, and a system of law that could bind men tighter than kinship ever had. The under oath was dead, the brotherhood shattered, but from its ashes arose something greater, the recognition that Temujin's destiny would not be shared. The steppe would one day belong to one vision alone, and he swore it would be his. The defeat at the Onon River lingered in memory like a wound that refused to heal. Temujin's disciplined force had fought bravely, but Jamukha's overwhelming numbers had crushed them. Many leaders might have vanished after such a setback, their names fading into the silence of the steppe. But Temujin was not like other leaders. He carried scars as lessons, and defeat, to him, was not an end, but a forge. As he retreated with the remnants of his followers, he did not despair. Instead, he studied every moment of the battle, the early successes, the encirclements that had nearly worked, the collapse when outnumbered, the failure of his scouts to anticipate the full scale of Jamukha's host. Each detail he carried like a stone in his memory, weighing it until it yielded insight. His men, though battered, saw his determination and drew strength from it. Around their dwindling fires, he spoke not of despair but of renewal. "We have tasted defeat," he told them, "but defeat teaches us more than victory. Jamukha rules through fear. We will rule through loyalty. His cruelty destroys trust. Our justice will build it." Slowly, warriors returned to him, not out of fear, but out of conviction. Men who had seen Jamukha's merciless execution of captives, who had watched 70 youths boiled alive, decided they preferred Temujin's fairness, even in loss. Jamukha had won the battle, but he had lost something greater, the faith of the steppe. Temujin began rebuilding carefully, refusing to rush into reckless confrontation. He gathered scattered families, offered protection, and emphasized discipline. He insisted that every raid be executed with precision, every dispute settled swiftly, every warrior treated with fairness. His reputation grew not through spectacle, but through consistency. Warriors knew that under Temujin, they would not be abandoned or cheated. From defeat, a stronger foundation emerged. Temujin's followers no longer saw him merely as a bold young Khan. They began to see him as a man of destiny, tempered by loss, hardened by resolve. Temujin understood that numbers alone had cost him victory. If he was to rise again, he would need allies, not fleeting kinship ties, but durable partnerships sealed by trust and mutual interest. He turned first to the Khairite, ruled by Togrul, known as Ong Khan. Years earlier, Yesugei, Temujin's father, had aided Togrul in his rise to power. Temujin now sought to revive that bond, presenting gifts and pledging loyalty. Togrul, recognizing both Temujin's potential and the advantage of an ambitious ally, agreed. The alliance brought Temujin legitimacy, for Ong Khan was one of the most respected rulers on the steppe. Another critical bond was with the Ongirat, cemented through Temujin's marriage to Berte. Berte had been promised to him since childhood, but now their union carried strategic weight. Through Berta, Temujin gained not only loyal in-laws, but also the strength of her wisdom and resilience. Berta would become more than a consort. She would be his partner in leadership, offering counsel and enduring trials alongside him. Alliances with other tribes followed, often secured not by bloodline, but by Temujin's reputation for fairness. He treated allies with respect, honored agreements, and punished betrayal swiftly. While Jamukha relied on fear to keep men in line, Temujin offered stability. This difference drew families weary of endless cycles of vengeance into his orbit. One alliance, however, brought pain alongside strength. The Merkits, remembering Yesugei's abduction of Hoelun decades earlier, raided Temujin's camp and kidnapped Berta. To Temujin, it was not only a personal wound, but a test of leadership. He called upon Ong Khan and Jamuka for aid, and together they pursued the Merkits, rescuing Berta. The victory demonstrated Temujin's ability to command allies, but it also highlighted the fragility of steppe politics. Jamuka had aided him this time, but their rivalry was far from over. Through these alliances, Temujin's host swelled once more. Families who had once scattered to survive returned under his banner. His men began to number in the thousands again, not through kinship alone, but through trust in his vision. As his strength grew, Temujin recognized a truth deeper than military power. Without law, unity would collapse. He had seen it in his childhood, when his father's death left his family abandoned. He had seen it in his youth, when betrayal by allies nearly destroyed him. He had seen it in Jamuka's cruelty, where fear bound men but also drove them away. Temujin resolved to create something unprecedented on the steppe. A system of laws that would bind men more tightly than kinship. Though it would later be known as the Yasa, its seeds were sown during these years of rebuilding. He began with simple principles. Theft within the camp was punished severely, for nothing destroyed trust faster than betrayal among comrades. Disputes over spoils were settled by clear rules, not the whims of chiefs. Women, often treated as property in steppe society, were given greater respect under his protection, reflecting his reverence for Hoelun and Berta. Captives were valued for their skills rather than reduced to mere servants, integrating them into the growing community. Most revolutionary was his insistence on meritocracy. Commanders were chosen not by birth, but by competence. A herdsman's son could rise to lead if he demonstrated courage and loyalty. This principle shocked many nobles, but inspired ordinary warriors, who flocked to his banner with renewed zeal. Temujin also emphasized loyalty through collective responsibility. Groups of 10, known as Arban, were bound together so tightly that the failure of one was the failure of all. This system instilled discipline and accountability, weaving bonds stronger than bloodlines. Around fires, elders muttered that such strictness was unnatural, that it defied the customs of the steppe. But younger warriors, weary of chaos and betrayal, embraced it. They saw in Temujin not only a Khan, but a lawgiver, someone who offered more than temporary glory. He offered a future. By the time his alliances solidified and his laws took root, Temujin had transformed his camp into something the steppe had never seen before. Not just a host of warriors, but the foundation of a nation. By the late 1182, Temujin's star was rising again. His defeat at Jamuka's hands was no longer spoken of as humiliation, but as a trial that had tempered him. With Ong Khan of the Kerite as his ally and Berta returned to his side, Temujin's camp swelled with warriors and families. His host, though not the largest on the steppe, was the most disciplined. The secret lay in structure. Where other Khans allowed their men to come and go freely, Temujin bound his warriors into fixed units. Arbans of 10, Jaghuns of 100, Mingans of 1,000. Every man knew his place, his comrades and his commander. Collective responsibility ensured discipline. If one man fled in battle, the entire unit bore the shame. If one man distinguished himself, the entire unit shared in the honor. This system eliminated the chaos that often unraveled steppe armies once the first arrows flew. Temujin's host moved with precision, as if guided by a single mind. Scouts reported enemy movements, relayed through flags and horns. Orders were clear, discipline enforced without hesitation. Warriors, accustomed to the loose traditions of the steppe, found the system demanding. But many embraced it. For the first time, they felt part of something greater than a chieftain's whim. Under Temujin, victories were not squandered by greed, nor were lives wasted by reckless charges. He treated even the lowliest rider as part of the body of the host, valued not for lineage, but for loyalty. The impact on morale was profound. Men who once wandered between camps in search of better prospects now stayed. Families followed, bringing herds, goods, and craftsmen. Temujin's camp became not only a military force, but a thriving community, an embryo of the empire to come. Strength, however, attracted enemies. Jamuka, still bitter from the Anders' betrayal, rallied his vast kinship network to strike Temujin again. But by now, the balance had shifted. Temujin was no longer the underdog scrambling for survival. He was a reformer with a loyal, disciplined host and powerful allies. The first major clash came against the Tatars. For centuries, the Tatars had been both rivals and pawns of the Chinese dynasties to the south. The Jin dynasty encouraged them to raid other tribes, keeping the steppe divided. Temujin, recognizing the threat, struck decisively. With Ong Khan at his side, he launched a coordinated campaign. His tactics shocked the Tatars. Instead of the usual hit-and-run raids, Temujin's forces encircled camps systematically, cutting off escape routes. Prisoners were taken not at random, but by design. Nobles who resisted were executed, while common families were spared and absorbed into his host. This dual policy of ruthlessness toward leaders and mercy toward followers undermined enemy morale. Many Tatar families, disillusioned with their chiefs, willingly accepted Temujin's rule. Next came the Merkits, who had once kidnapped Berta. Temujin's memory of that insult burned like fire. With the combined strength of his own men and the Kherite, he struck their settlements swiftly. Again, discipline carried the day. Instead of scattering after victory, Temujin ensured captives were divided fairly, herds catalogued, and new families integrated into his host. The Merkits, once proud, were shattered as a major power. Each victory swelled his ranks, not only in numbers, but in reputation. The steppe began to whisper a new truth. Temujin was not merely a Khan, he was a unifier, a man whose strength lay in more than blood. Where Jamuka sowed fear, Temujin sowed order. Where other chiefs ruled for themselves, Temujin built something that outlasted a single raid. Jamuka could not ignore this. He rallied allies once more, determined to crush Temujin. But here the difference between their leadership was stark. Jamuka demanded loyalty by invoking ancestry. Temujin inspired it by proving fairness. When the two forces clashed again, many of Jamuka's warriors hesitated, some even defecting mid-battle. The tide was turning. Temujin, though not yet supreme, had begun systematically dismantling his rivals. One by one, tribes that once resisted found themselves either destroyed or integrated. With rivals falling and his host expanding, Temujin faced a question larger than warfare: how to govern the swelling body of people under his command. He knew well that victory in battle was fleeting if unity dissolved afterward. The chaos of his childhood, the betrayals of his youth, and the brutality of Jamuka's vengeance all pressed upon his mind. And so, he began to codify the laws that would later be known as the Yasa. These laws touched every aspect of life. Theft was punished severely, for nothing eroded trust faster than stealing from comrades. Murder within the host was forbidden without trial, ensuring disputes did not spiral into endless blood feuds. Women were protected, reflecting his reverence for Hoelun and Berta. While not equal in status, They were granted rights rare for the steppe. Captives with useful skills, blacksmiths, weavers, healers, were integrated rather than discarded. Every man, regardless of birth, owed loyalty to his unit and his Khan above clan ties. Perhaps most radical was the principle of meritocracy. Leaders were chosen for ability, not ancestry. This cut at the heart of steppe tradition, infuriating nobles but thrilling ordinary warriors. Under Temujin, a shepherd could rise to command thousands if he proved loyal and capable. The laws were enforced without hesitation. Stories spread of Temujin punishing even close allies for violations, proving that no one was above justice. At first, some muttered that he was too harsh, but gradually, warriors realized that his severity created security. In Temujin's camp, men could sleep without fear of theft, women without fear of abduction, and warriors with the assurance that loyalty would be rewarded. The image of Temujin as a Khan of justice spread across the steppe. Families weary of chaos flocked to him, choosing his strict order over the unpredictability of other chiefs. By the time the 1190 seconds dawned, Temujin had become more than a survivor, more than a reformer. He was a force reshaping the steppe itself. Jamuka still loomed, and great trials lay ahead, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. The boy who once wore the collar of humiliation now commanded tens of thousands. The orphan, once abandoned by allies, had forged a host bound not by blood, but by law and loyalty. And though the title Genghis Khan was not yet his, the man who would bear it had already emerged. The year was 1206. On the banks of the Onon River, where green valleys met rolling steppes, the assembled tribes raised their voices in a grand kurultai. Warriors, nobles, shamans, and herders gathered from every corner of Mongolia. The fractured peoples of the steppe, once divided by clan and kinship, by endless blood feuds and betrayals, now looked to a single man for unity. Temujin, son of Yasuge, grandson of the Borjigin line, stood before them. His life had been forged in abandonment, captivity, and betrayal, yet also in resilience, loyalty, and vision. That vision had triumphed. The Merkits were broken, the Tatars crushed, the Taichi Ud humbled. Jamuka, his former blood brother turned enemy, captured and executed. Rival Khans had been either defeated or bound to him by marriage and alliance. The council acclaimed him with a new title, Genghis Khan, universally translated as Genghis Khan, meaning oceanic ruler or universal lord. It was more than a title. It was a declaration that Temujin was no longer just a tribal Khan. He was now sovereign over all Mongols, commander of a new order that would stretch beyond the horizons of the steppe. The Kurultai formalized the laws of the Yasa, embedding justice, loyalty, and discipline into the empire's very bones. New banners were raised, symbolizing not clans but units, Arbans, Jaguns, Mingans, Tumans. No longer would Mongol armies fracture along kinship lines. They were now one host, one people, bound under one Khan. The moment was electrifying. Steppe society, once fragmented and fragile, had transformed into the most formidable war machine the world had yet seen. And its new master was a man who believed he was chosen by eternal heaven itself. The world beyond Mongolia soon learned what this transformation meant. Genghis Khan unleashed his armies in waves that reshaped civilizations. First came the Xia and Jin dynasties of northern China. For centuries, the Chinese emperors had manipulated steppe tribes, playing one against another. Now, the strategy collapsed. Mongol armies stormed fortress after fortress, bypassing strongholds with feigned retreats, cutting supply lines, and deploying Chinese and Muslim engineers who built catapults and siege towers. Towns that resisted were annihilated. Those that surrendered swiftly were spared. A clear message echoed: submit and live, resist and perish. The Mongols adapted with terrifying speed. They mastered siege warfare, naval riverine battles, and psychological campaigns. Cities that once boasted impenetrable walls fell within weeks. Refugees streamed across the land, spreading tales of Mongol ruthlessness and discipline. By 1215, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, had fallen. Its walls breached, its treasures plundered, its people massacred. Northern China bent beneath Mongol rule. Then came the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, a vast Islamic state rich with cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. Genghis sought trade and diplomacy, but the massacre of his caravan and ambassadors at Otrar sealed the empire's fate. His response was not merely punitive, it was apocalyptic. Entire armies were annihilated in the open field. Cities that defied him were razed, their populations enslaved or executed. At Samarkand, artisans and scholars were spared and sent east, while defenders who resisted were buried beneath the ruins. The empire of Khwarezm was reduced to ashes. From there, the Mongol storms surged westward into the Caucasus, Persia, and the edges of Eastern Europe. In 1223, at the Battle of the Khalkha River, 20,000 Mongols annihilated a coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies, using feigned retreats to lure the enemy into ambush. The Russian commanders were crushed, their nobles executed under planks, while Mongols feasted upon them, a grim demonstration of Mongol psychological warfare. To the east, his generals pressed deeper into China. To the south, they probed into the Islamic world. To the west, his scouts glimpsed the great cities of Europe. No frontier seemed beyond reach. Wherever they went, the Mongols left devastation, but also order. Roads were secured, trade routes reopened under Mongol protection. Caravans traveled from the Pacific to the Mediterranean with unprecedented safety, carrying silk, spices, and ideas. The Pax Mongolica was born from blood, paradoxically blending terror with stability. In 1227, Genghis Khan died. The details remain uncertain. Some sources claim he fell from his horse during a campaign against the Western Shah. Others whisper of assassination, or of a wound concealed to prevent panic among the troops. What is certain is that his death was hidden, his body secretly transported back to Mongolia. Legends say he was buried in an unmarked grave on the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain, guarded by rivers diverted to conceal the site. By the time of his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, an expanse larger than Rome at its height. Yet his greatest legacy was not land alone, but transformation. He had shattered the tribal order of the steppe, forging instead a meritocratic empire. He had built a military system that prioritized discipline over blood ties, strategy over impulse. He had established religious tolerance, allowing Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans to coexist under Mongol rule. He had woven the world into a single network of trade and communication, enabling the Silk Road to thrive as never before. His descendants carried the empire even further. Urgadai, his son, conquered the Jin dynasty and pressed into Europe. Batu Khan led armies into Russia and Hungary. Hulagu toppled Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate. Kublai, grandson of Genghis, conquered the Song dynasty and founded the Yuan dynasty in China. Yet, all of this flowed from one man's vision. Temujin, the abandoned boy who once wore the humiliating wooden collar, had risen to command the largest contiguous empire in history. His laws, his discipline, his ruthless pragmatism, and his relentless belief in destiny reshaped continents. The Mongol storm was both devastation and creation. Cities burned, yet trade flourished. Populations were slaughtered, yet knowledge spread. Terror marched hand in hand with tolerance. And at the center of it all stood Genghis Khan, a man who began as an orphan on the frozen steppe and ended as the architect of a new world. His empire would fracture with time, yet his influence endures in borders drawn, in trade routes carved, in legends told. The very fabric of Eurasia was rewoven by his hand. Even today, his name carries awe and fear. He is remembered as both scourge and state builder, destroyer and lawgiver. Genghis Khan's story is not one of simple conquest, but of transformation born from suffering, discipline forged by hardship, and ambition carried on horseback across the world. And so, as the winds still howl across the Mongolian steppe and the eternal blue sky stretches endlessly above, the legacy of Genghis Khan endures immortal, oceanic, and universal.